So again, welcome everybody, and delighted to welcome quite a few non-members here tonight, and to all of the people on Zoom also welcome, because Marcus is going to present very, very interesting, I know, to all of us, what's happening with the Victoria Park and the Olympics and so on, with probably some of the concepts that he researches in engagement theatre. He will explain these. Bedazzlement, how to analyse political legitimacy, and how that's manufactured in promise making rather than participatory decision making. So some of those concepts I'm sure we're going to hear more about. So without further ado, please welcome Marcus Foth to the stage. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for the introduction. We'll get underway. There is a lot of material to go through, but my slides are usually full of visuals, so hopefully there is lots to look at rather than to read. The topic is the Brisbane Olympics. We're all familiar that Brisbane has been awarded the Olympics, so the focus will be on looking at the tension between whether we will have green Olympics, sustainable Olympics, or whether it is actually more a greenwashed spectacle. Before I get underway, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where we're gathered here, the Yagara and the Turrbal people, north and south of the Brisbane River, and pay respects to elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits. And acknowledge the important role that Torres Strait Islander Aboriginal people play, not just in the QUT community, but really in the entire nation. I'll start with some introduction just to set the scene of where I'm coming from. I'm not a trained geographer to my sins. I have worked in that space and researched that space for quite some time. My original background has been in computer science. And in 2006, I started a research group at QUT called Urban Informatics. And so you can see that there is a spatial element to it. It was this coming together of three large domains: the people, place, technology triad, the social sciences, the spatial sciences, and the technical sciences, if you'd like. My own background originally was in computer science, as I said, so I had quite an interest in how technology is used in cities. The triad is between people, place, and technology. It's an interdisciplinary group because we are trying to combine, and now let me just get rid of that floating thing again. Okay. We are trying to combine theories, approaches from those three areas of academia. And that has been really interesting over the years. When we started in 2006, we were one of the first groups, not just in Australia, but even worldwide, to use that approach that combines this very multidisciplinary approach. Fast forward to today, and you can see this timeline here. It already finishes in 2015. There's now been a plethora of these different research centers that have emerged at various universities, but also it's been adopted by industry. And the big term that a lot of industry and government entities have been using is the smart city. The smart city is a term that refers to the use of technology, the use of sensors, the use of CCTV cameras, a whole bunch of data analytics in order to introduce digital technology into the built environment. And so that has been our focus for a long time. Some of the works that we've been doing early on was around rights to the digital city. Those that are familiar with Henry Lefebvre's original term, the right to the city, might remember that work that was published at the time. And we've been looking at trying to update this because there is new challenges and new opportunities when it comes to the introduction of digital technology. This came out in 2015. We've been experimenting with participatory approaches. We've been looking at living labs. This was funded by the Australian Research Council in order to be more, I suppose, listening and genuine in our approach to community engagement. And more recently, we've also been focusing on sustainability, but more so from a post-anthropocentric point of view. So rather than sustainability the way it's usually framed, which is to try and reduce harm, we are trying to do this differently. We're trying to look at a more than human approach, which means that we are decentering humans and challenging human exceptionalism in the way that we design cities. Now, the work that I do usually straddles two research centers at QUT. One is the design lab that you see there on the left, and as was already mentioned, the Digital Media Research Center. So there is that focus on more than human futures, and a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about today is situated in that quadrant there. We also were very lucky that we had success with what's called an industrial transformation training center, and that is focusing on automated vehicles in rural and regional areas. And we are continuing to focus on smart cities, particularly from the point of view of governance. We are looking at how data gets governed in smart cities, and what some of the issues are around surveillance, around privacy, around sovereignty. And this is probably another area that we'll straddle today in today's talk. We've also been looking into inclusion, participation, and community advocacy. And I see some of the familiar faces that are particularly situated in that space of community advocacy. My talk has 3 sections. The third one is relatively short because it's really just a teaser for something that only happened last week. So this is the first one that is really about the Olympics not being climate positive anymore. So this was what we saw not just here in the national news, but worldwide. This is Anastasia Palaszczuk, at the time Premier, in Japan, when the Brisbane 2032 Olympics were awarded to Brisbane, which was a collaborative bid between the Australian Olympic Committee, the Brisbane City Council, the state of Queensland, and in collaboration with the awarding organization, which is the IOC, the International Olympic Committee. I'm mentioning all these entities because they're going to be our key protagonists in what is to unfold. Now, what happened at this time is not only was there a lot of celebration at the time that a lot of people were struggling with COVID and COVID restrictions, and the celebrations extended to a very historic moment. So this wasn't just historic because Brisbane got the Olympics. The other element to it being a historic moment was about the fact that it was in the history of the Olympics the very first time that the International Olympics Committee required, legally obliged the host city to organize these games to be climate positive. And you can see some of the news articles there. There's plenty of others. Now, what does it actually mean? A lot of the terminology these days still uses the phrase net zero, and that comes from the fact of trying to reduce our carbon emissions to zero, depending on the activity, whether it's driving a car, whether it's producing food, whether it's having lights in here, and there is, a number of other examples of where human activity continues to produce carbon emissions. So the original goal was to say, okay, we need to reduce our carbon emissions. We want to get to net zero. Now, climate positive sometimes is also referred to as nature positive, or net positive, is going beyond that. So rather than just doing a zero-sum game, we're looking at reducing carbon even more, and we're doing more for the environment than what would be required just to break even, right? So if you have a baseline, we are kind of over here. We're trying to reduce harm. We're trying to reduce carbon emissions. If you're at the target of net zero, if you subscribe to a target of being climate positive, you want to go beyond that. You are actually trying to reduce more carbon from the environment. You want to do more for nature, for the environment, than what would be otherwise required. So that's in a nutshell what climate positive would require. What happened in the lead up to 2021, when Palaszczuk just announced Brisbane was successful, is that previous successful bids, so we've had now Paris last year, Paris was 2024, and we are about to get the summer games in LA. And we just a couple of weeks ago had the Winter Games in Italy. So there's obviously a number of games every 2 years up until Brisbane. Those other games were voluntarily trying to do the same thing. They were also saying, we're going to try and do really, really good. We're going to be green, sustainable. We have that kind of commitment. But Brisbane at this time was the very first one that had a contract that said you must. Now, this is pretty important for what's to happen because the organization unfolded. We are looking at different negotiations around venues. I won't go into the detail around what happened with the Gabba Stadium, but this is now a screenshot only recently. So these documents are still available that anyone can look up. This is Brisbane 2032 Olympic Games, and is hosted by the Olympics themselves. So olympics.com is the website. So it's very official. It's the official website for the Olympics, and these are the official documents for the host contract. And so in discussions with our research partners, I was talking to a colleague and said, look, all of these, this political back and forth, all these kinds of negotiations about stadiums and so forth, it's really bizarre because we made this commitment to be climate positive. So the fact that we are considering building these new stadiums, and there was discussions about where it would go, whether it's the Gabba, whether it's going into the north side, Hamilton side, whether it's somewhere at Nathan, and the list goes on. So before the current situation with Victoria Park unfolded, we had a lot of back and forth, and lots of people in the audience might remember that. And at that time, I said to this colleague, this is really bizarre because all of these kinds of stadiums that are being, these fantasies that are being discussed, they're really in violation of the commitment. And so then one of the colleagues I spoke to said, I've heard from people higher up that that's actually not the case anymore. I said, what do you mean? Well, that's all been removed. That commitment has been removed. You can't just have all of this media fanfare and you herald to the whole world that this is a historic moment because we are the first city to do this, and then it's just been removed. Surely that's not right. So then I started digging, and the person was correct. What they had been told by people in public service was actually true. So when you look closer, the last entry there, it says Olympic host contract, operational requirements, October 2022, but in brackets it says with addendum. What does addendum mean? Latin word. Something has changed there, no? So let's look at this. So this is the addendum and the changes, and conveniently, they've given us the track changes. You can see the old version and the new version, so it's very easy to see. You don't have to read everything, maybe just the very big part that I zoomed into. So there it says, originally, the actions to deliver climate positive games, that means avoid, minimize, and compensate more than 100% of residual emissions and influence. That wording has been removed and replaced with the wording minimize direct and indirect games-related carbon emissions. And then you can see some of the other mentions. Pretty much every single mention of climate positive has been removed and replaced with a commitment to minimize the game's carbon footprint. Now, if you are trying to voluntarily minimize the damage you're causing, that is very different to the original contractual obligation to be climate positive, no? So that is a fact. Now, the other fact, though, is who knew about this at the time? Here's a bit of history, because that's also part of this document. There was a letter dated the 22nd of December 2022, then another letter dated 22nd of June 23, and then there was a bit of a gap. And we're not quite sure what happened there, but we're very interested to try and dig further. This is not really academic research. It should really be investigative journalism that digs deeper into this gap between the 22nd of June 2023 and then all of a sudden, whoops, on the 7th of December 2023, the IOC, the International Olympics Committee, sent an email to all the Australian organisations, Brisbane City Council, State of Queensland, Australian Olympic Committee, saying that they want a slightly revised version of the Olympic host contract and the operational requirements. So the abbreviation OR is the operational requirements document. And so then email came back and it was confirming that they're all happy with those amendments that we've just seen. So this version history suggests that the changes were initiated not by us. They were somehow initiated by the International Olympic Committee. The reason why this is fishy is because they were the ones pushing for a sustainability agenda that needed to be much more progressive to what they had been previously. So it's not very much in keeping with all the other public policy and procedural documents that the IOC had been authoring and writing and publishing to this date. And here you can see the signatures. The signatures themselves are not part of the PDF because it's for privacy reasons. They removed that, but you can see it was signed off by Adrian Schrinner as mayor, by Stephen Miles at the time as the premier, Ian Chesterman as the chairperson of the Australian Olympic Committee, and we got other signatures for the IOC there. So this was all signed off pretty much around April. The last signature there is Stephen Miles, 30th of May, 2024. Now, the other part of this that is interesting is that there was no media. So if you compare this to 2021, when this first happened, and there was lots of coverage, lots of articles, everyone was just so stoked that we would be doing this, taking on this challenge. It would be turning Brisbane into a very progressive and very sustainable kind of city. The media was entirely absent around this time. And that is quite bizarre in its own right. And I'll return to this point later. The fact that we have a document that is obviously very crucial for the way that these games are hosted, it was amended. The amendments are in the public domain, and the media didn't pick up on it. So then it required me to publish this very first article on the 31st of March, 2025. And I'm not seeking praise. I'm actually seeking excuses or apologies from the media for not doing it themselves. Like, why is that my job as an academic? And there could be another lecture on my experience of actually trying to get this published, which was just completely extraordinary, because for those familiar with this outlet, The Conversation, they are great. They work with academics so that we can get our very complicated journal articles, conference papers, translated into lay language. That's kind of what they specialize in. So I went to them because I've been working with them in the past, and I said, look, I got actual breaking news. And they had a heart attack because they don't deal with breaking news. So they made me get rights of reply as if I'm a journalist. So I had to go to the minister and the premier and the IOC in Switzerland and get them all to write back to me. And so they did eventually. And then they said, but your article needs to be 800 words. I said, well, these replies are already 1,200 words. That's your problem. You got to work that in there. So anyway, eventually it came out. But again, it was the very first article, and it didn't get much traction beyond very specific circles. It did have close to 30,000 readers, but usually this should have been picked up and rebroadcast by the ABC, by Sydney Morning Herald. Like, this would have been a big deal. Now, there's those two terms mentioned earlier, the present bedazzlement engagement theatre, and I'd like to explain what I mean by these two terms. After this episode of looking into the silent, quiet kind of removal of our climate positive commitment, I started getting more interested in what's actually going on. And so I did a small research project that looked at Olympic Games from Sydney onwards. And this is the list of games from Sydney onwards. At the time I did this, Utah in 2034, the Winter Games hadn't been announced. So it was from Sydney 2000 to Brisbane 2032. And so as you can see, this includes Summer Games and Winter Games. Now, the ones I've highlighted now in yellow are the ones that committed and eventually built new stadiums and new venues. I was only really interested in the major Olympic stadiums that would host the opening ceremony and the closing ceremonies. And you can see that Sydney falls in that category, Beijing, London, Sochi, Pyeongchang, and Tokyo. And then all of a sudden, there's a whole bunch of Olympic Games, both winter and summer, that started to reuse venues. And then there's Brisbane. Now, I want to explain this to you because this is quite important. The Olympic Committee, the International Olympic Committee, published a significant policy in 2018 called the New Norm. And the new norm was in response to a lot of criticism that hosting the Olympics is bankrupting cities. In fact, it's sometimes bankrupting countries because of the cost. And so the IOC recognized that a lot of cities were building elephants that were just sitting there and were not actually being used after the games. That was a problem. So the new norm policy is about, first of all, prioritizing the reuse of existing venues. Second of all, to elevate the sustainability and green commitments, as we've just talked about. And third of all, it allows for games to be decentralized and regional. So they don't have to be limited to just one city. They can be in multiple cities that are within a region in order to maximize, again, the reuse of venues. So that was released in 2018. Now, because cities that host the games get the bid awarded years and years in advance, you can see Brisbane got awarded 2021. We are hosting in 2032. There's a lot of time in between. But you can pretty much see from that red line that there isn't any more cities now that are building new venues except for us. Brisbane is the odd one out, and in clear violation of their host contract.
Drill, baby, drill, right here in Victoria Park. This is part of the government's plan for our 63,000-seat Brisbane Stadium to replace the Gabba once it comes down after 2032.
So that was the Deputy Premier, and these are some of the latest renders of some of these new venues. And because I'm talking at the Royal Geographic Society, I'm hoping there's lots of geographers in the room that have a keen eye for maps and for spatial visualizations like that, because there will be plenty of these now. So here's a render that is currently going through the media. They keep changing slightly. So again, keen eye on the detail. This is the Aquatic Centre. Not too far from here. We might even have our building in here, in the background somewhere. Which way are we looking? No, we would be that way. This is the Olympic Village. And if you go to the GEECA website, the Games Independent Infrastructure Coordination Authority, you would see that there is more venues. The Brisbane Stadium we just saw, there's the Logan Indoor Sports Centre, the Moreton Bay Indoor Sports Centre, the Sunshine Coast Mountain Bike Centre. We just seen the render for a National Aquatic Centre that's going to replace the one that is here in Spring Hill, the Para Sports Facility, and also of note the Redland Whitewater Centre in prime koala habitat. So what is it that allows Brisbane to get away with the fact of building all these new venues when the International Olympic Committee has actually been, by decree, requiring all host cities to reuse existing cities? Strange. Now, there's a certain level of bedazzlement going on with these renders. And that is now the crucial element I'm trying to illustrate with some of these pictures. So let's go back to Sydney 2000. I've been, as I said, the approach I've taken is to go to all the games between 2000 and 2032, but only focusing on those games that built new venues, new stadiums. And Sydney 2000 was obviously one that fits the bill, and this is Homebush or Stadium Australia. It has changed its name quite a bit. I think at some stage it was the Accor Stadium. What's the current name for the stadium? Does anyone know? Just the Sydney Stadium. So I went and looked at the artist impressions, and then I went and looked at what it actually looks like when it's under construction. Now, the under construction pictures reveal that for a stadium of this kind of caliber, for that size to be erected, you need laydown yards, you need access roads, you need rubble to be deposited and then removed, you need building material to be deposited and then put together, and the list goes on. So you can see there's, you know, a lot going on just in this picture. And there's the finished product. And I went and did this for the others as well, and there's a certain pattern that emerges. So this is Beijing in 2008, and this is the original render. And what you can already probably tell between Sydney 2000 and Beijing 2008 is that the artist impressions usually create an impression of bedazzlement, because they're trying to bedazzle. They're trying to bedazzle by having birds in the sky, blue sky anyway, happy children, lots of trees that don't exist later, and the list goes on. So an artist impression has obviously been commissioned by the proponents of the project. The proponents of the project wanted to be approved. They are looking for the social license from the public. And so the renders then all of a sudden visualize happy people, happy environment. Tick the box. Under construction. Finished product. London 2012. That was the artist impression before it was before construction began. London is interesting because they did do pretty well in cleaning up an area that was very much contaminated. So it's not that that was pristine green space in London at the time. This was already pretty run down. You can see here the stadium under construction. And Olympic Park, London, completed. Sochi is in Russia. This is Winter Games. The render here was produced by Populous, which is actually a architectural firm that specializes in sports infrastructure in stadiums, and they have been part of a lot of the Olympic stadiums. In fact, they were also part of the design and construction of the Sydney Stadium. So this is Sochi, and this is a render by Populous. Populous was founded here in Brisbane. It does. It does. The artist impression is interesting from that point of view that it actually omits a lot of detail, but you can't leave the trees out. The trees have to be in there. This is the stadium under construction. You can see it there in the lower right corner, and other parts of what was built. What I didn't find is that kind of aerial shot that shows that area before all of this happened, but it was a UNESCO heritage site, I'm told, and this is the finished product there. Pyeongchang also has an interesting element. So this is in South Korea in 2018, again for Winter Games, because of, again, what I mentioned earlier, the risk of these stadiums turning into kind of white elephants that are not used. They decided that the stadium is going to be demolished straight afterwards. So this is the artist's impression. And because the government had this commitment to remove the stadium straight away, they also had an artist's impression for what it would look like once it had been removed. So this is the artist's impression of what it should look like when the greenery is re-established. I do like the added feature of helium balloons. And that building is a museum for the Winter Olympics 2018. What happened? This is construction. This is the actual stadium that was built, and the stadium was demolished. So this is the only stadium that only hosted 4 events of that magnitude, which is the opening and closing ceremonies of the Winter Olympics and Paralympics. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's it. Yes. We got to wait for Q&A, otherwise people on Zoom won't be able to hear you. So I'll get you to talk into the microphone. Last one before we return to Brisbane, this is Tokyo. To be fair, the Tokyo before and after is probably one of the most cohesive. So this is the artist's impression of the stadium for the Tokyo Olympics that are still referred to as 2020, but because of the COVID restrictions happen in 2021. This is the stadium under construction, and this is the finished product. Now, what about Brisbane? So Brisbane 32, I did show you already some of the current renders that have been used, but this is the one that really piqued my interest because it's a lie. What's wrong with it? The trees lean onto the stadium of what, 14 stories? How can you preserve gum trees of that height whilst a stadium is under construction that is supposed to hold 63,000 seats? What else? There's no forecourt. So any stadium requires there to be an evacuation plan. And if there's busy programming, it also means you've got to hold 63,000 people that want to enter, whilst another 63,000 people want to exit. And so the forecourt is there for that to occur, for there to be safe evacuation if the need arises. But also modeling has shown that the transport system, even once it's been expanded in capacity, would never actually allow 63,000 people to exit at the same time, so they need to be slowed down. How do you slow down people? You give them a hot dog or a burger or a beer, like Caxton Street. That's what's slowing, I'm very serious, that's what slows down Suncorp Stadium. Without any kind of those facilities surrounding Suncorp Stadium, the transport system would collapse. It already collapses at the best of times with Suncorp Stadium, even though all the roads are being blocked off. But there is usually design around these stadiums because people want to go to a stadium, not just for the 2 weeks that we host the Olympics, but this is actually Queensland's gift to the AFL. And so once you have AFL fans and cricket fans go in and out, they need other entertainment, and that's not showing. What else is wrong with it?
Underground, all the rail and parking and everything must be underground or something.
I was going to say the same thing. There's no like roads for people to walk.
Yes, it kind of looks like it's just been very gently lowered by a huge drone in its place. Maybe it was manufactured in China and then we've just been, you know, putting it there very carefully. All right. The other part to it is that this ability to produce bedazzlement, we can now all engage in. It's available to anyone. You just jump online or on your phone, you use ChatGPT, and you just say, I want there to be a large South Bank lagoon. You don't like the lagoon? What about Opera House 2.0? You want Opera House 2.0? Don't like that? Maybe you kind of think that, you know, with whatever Trump's doing, we need to defend ourselves. Do a rocket launcher. So you can see that, this takes me now 20 seconds, which previously required there to be people trained in graphic design, in spatial design, getting the dimensions right, operating in Photoshop, operating in various specialized pieces of software. But we are now able to do these kinds of things by outsourcing it to AI, but that ability is also now able to be used by large design firms that are producing renders that are not in step with the level of literacy, the level of spatial geography literacy. Because whilst you've been able to pick this up because you got a trained eye and you're geographers largely, the media did not. There was not a single journalist that kind of said, hang on a minute, this image is bedazzlement. It's trying to portray an image that we can have our cake and eat it. There was no scrutiny. I looked for it. There's no scrutiny. There is the trees, very tall. Save Victoria Park is a community group that has been active in this space and been working to expose some of that missing scrutiny. So the level of scrutiny that we usually expect the news media to apply just doesn't happen in Australia anymore. It's gone. It's extinct. It's as rare as a numbat. We don't see it. There would just be articles over articles over articles that are just regurgitating press releases that have been written by either politicians or by developers or by architects, and the journalists either don't have the time or the ability to ask the question, is this even true? And so we rely on community groups to do that level of scrutiny and fact-checking. And here is a bit of fact-checking that is quite humorous, but at the same time very sad, which is that we overlaid the actual existing Perth Stadium, the Optus Stadium in Perth, that sits 60,000 people, so same capacity, over this render, and you can see that it's nearly double the size. And there is also some indication of how much forecourt would be required. And you can see once it's placed in its true dimension into the environment, that it creates a very different impression to what the average reader of the Courier Mail would see when they only see the bedazzlement render. So this is what's missing right now. It's both the spatial literacy to see through the engagement theater and the bedazzlement, and we're also missing the level of scrutiny to tell people that this is not actually a true render. It has those particular issues. This was published in the Fifth Estate. I'm happy to eventually share these slides with you so you can have a look at some of the articles where the different artist impressions are juxtaposed with the actual finished product. Now, there's a couple of news articles I put in there just to catch us up with what's been happening in the Olympic space. So the government introduced a particular bill to Parliament that is either suspending or amending 15 pieces of legislation, including planning, various environmental provisions in the sustainability kind of context, but also importantly, the heritage provisions for Victoria Park. We've also had a First Nations group that launched a bid to protect Victoria Park from that development. There's two sections under the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Act, Section 9 for immediate reaction or protection by the minister, and Section 10, which requires a little bit more back and forth and discussion. Murray Watt is Senator federal level and also the Minister for the Environment. He has rejected the Section 9 application under that act, but Section 10 applications, I think there's two, Neil would need to correct me, there's two. There's two under Section 10. They are still pending, and we still haven't heard from Murray Watt of what he's going to do about those. We've also had the Heritage Council expand the listing at the proposed Olympic Stadium site, and thank you, Neil, for leading that effort. Very well done. But because of the Polar Bill, that is now not really producing the intended effect of protection because the heritage provisions have been suspended. And we got stadium opponents that continue to agitate against what is being proposed. But the latest development that only occurred, you can see here, if I had my glasses on, the 13th of February, was this article in the Brisbane Times. Overnight, the entire area has been transformed from a doggett, which is a deed in trust that was given to Brisbane City Council by the state government, so Crown land, and converted into freehold. Now, freehold land means you can do other things with it. This is the more recent render that I showed you, like a aerial view that I found on the Arcadis website. Again, republished by SMH, Sydney Morning Herald. So they just used it and said, oh, here you go. Look, isn't that nice? High, glossy, pretty pictures of what you will get Brisbane. But a little bit later, after the conversion from a doggett into freehold, should I do it again? So the perspective is slightly different, but notice what else changed.
Units. Development.
So that whole green space above the stadium is now occupied by a whole bunch of high-rises. And this is the latest render that you can find on the Archipelago website. Now, final section before we get to Q&A. I did do one more piece on Brisbane that was published in the Fifth Estate only last week. In that piece, and this is ongoing work I'm doing with my research student, Rosa. She is an architect and is now doing a Master of Philosophy with me. We've been looking at a comparison between Singapore and Brisbane, particularly with this focus on the Olympics and the kind of development that is occurring. And we are looking at what we call copy and paste urbanism, which actually is a term that's been coined by a colleague in Spain. The copy and paste approach really is that of a cookie cutter. So we get decision makers that travel the world, and because the two gateways to get anywhere is mostly Dubai and Singapore, a lot of the decision makers, they fly through Singapore. And so they like what they see. And what they particularly like is the marina, which is one of the key pieces of architecture that you would see in Singapore. And so we've now got Queen's Wharf that replicates this element of a sky deck. So we're using that to juxtapose some of the kind of iconic elements that Singapore came up with that everyone associates as kind of touristic icons. And then what Brisbane does, it's plagiarize it by just looking at what is Singapore doing, what are other world cities doing, and rather than being original, we just go there and copy it. Now, the next project to be copied is the Gardens by the Bay. The Gardens by the Bay are on reclaimed land. Singapore obviously is very close to the equator. It's very much a tropical city. It has had, since the mid-60s, a very heavy policy around embracing what's called the garden city. Now, being a garden is kind of interesting. We all maybe have a garden at home, but being a gardener means you're the one in control. If I want to grow carrots, I'm going to grow carrots. If I don't like the weeds, I go to Bunnings and buy Roundup and put Roundup on it. So the gardener is about being in control, and that's precisely what happens in Singapore. So our analysis, and I won't go into detail here, but I encourage you to look at this piece, is very much about the fact that Singapore state government has very strict rules about what nature is good and what nature is not good. We don't like the snails that have been introduced by the Japanese soldiers as a source of protein. So they get exterminated. We don't like the pigeons. You can't feed them, otherwise you get a $5,000 fine. But we do like our reclaimed land and the exotic plants from all over the world that are sitting in 24/7 air-conditioned glass houses. Because some of the climatic zones require it to be cooler than what Singapore is. And so these glass domes are very much climate controlled, and they are entertainment centers. So Brisbane wants what Singapore's got. And the same company that has been producing the Olympic renders is now going after Mount Coot-tha. So this is the proposal for the Botanic Gardens at Mount Coot-tha that are supposed to get demolished and turned into an entertainment park. That is also climate controlled. Like, people might have seen this in the media and think this is for the quarry. This is not for the quarry. And to top it off, we also like light shows because Singapore got light shows. These are not real trees, they're artificial trees. There's solar panels on top. There's highly curated selections of plants that grow there. They have been curated so that something is blooming at any time of the year, because visitors that pay the entrance fee to this theme park, they want to see pretty flowers. So the landscapers have created that impression that there's these things growing on the trunk of these artificial super trees, as they're called, but they're not native, and they're always artificially in season to be always in flower, to always look pretty, so that you can take your selfie and post it on Instagram. Now, is that sustainability? Well, but we love it, so we copy it. So now we have this proposal of the laser and light show that was supposed to go to Mount Coot-tha. Because of ongoing community opposition, it's been put into the Ciromet area, which is Mount Cotton. So we have these light shows happening in that space. I'll leave you with a couple of links. There is a website that has emerged that does what the journalists are not doing, which is to apply scrutiny to a lot of the decision makers, and it's the Games Watchdog 2032.au. I encourage everyone to check out some of the resources that are on there, because that's the kind of stuff that you should be reading on ABC, on Crikey, on Guardian Australia, on news.com.au. No, not news.com.au. I mentioned Say Victoria Park. They've been doing a phenomenal job. Is anyone here from Say Victoria Park? Thank you for doing what you're doing. They've also been producing their own spatial comparisons, which are quite impressive. So this one, for instance, shows the scale of green space available in Brisbane compared to other big cities. And it's minuscule. You kind of think, oh, Victoria Park is this huge area, but compared to the city that we're aspiring to be, with 3,000 new people arriving every month, we actually got to have more green space. We are the city in Australia with the least amount of green space comparatively to the other capitals, and the international comparison, we are now removing that altogether. So if you are relying on Roma Street parklands, it doesn't even feature on the map. I did want to do a shout out to Redlands, because I did mention earlier the whitewater rafting facility. Redlands 2030 have been very active at the time around the Toondah Harbour development that was supposed to be built in the Ramsar wetlands, where all the shorebirds arrive to get a rest from their migratory paths. One of the new campaigns there is to save the koalas in that particular patch of forest that is marked for demolishment to make space for a whitewater rafting facility. Again, the media is largely absent. What I also encourage everyone to do is think about the entire spectrum from left to right of where the media is. It doesn't really matter which channel you subscribe to, they're largely absent. And that is a problem for democracy, and it's a problem for the way that our cities and our built environment evolves, because we need them to hold decision makers to account. What's that famous saying? Keep the bastards honest. They're not. Some of our own writings, this one is going deeper into this term I've been using, engagement theatre, which is the spectacle, the appearance of being engaged, of being asked questions by government and decision makers, but it has no meaning because decisions have been made already. Morris's colleague taught me that very famous abbreviation DAD, D-A-D, decide, announce, defend. That's really what happens a lot of the time. We did publish with colleagues in Torino that hosted the Winter Olympics in 2006, and we did a comparison of both Turin and Brisbane, and that is an open source article that is available online. And there's further things that we've published, further readings and papers By the way, this is from the International Olympic Campus in ancient Olympia in Greece. I do like their slogans of the joy of effort, solidarity, peace, fair play. But the fact that the infrastructure that has been built in the name of the Olympics is causing so much destruction, so much harm, doesn't feature in a lot of the language being used. This is by Cameron Murray, who is a economist and specifically looking at property economics. He wrote a book called Rigged, How Networks of Powerful Maids Rip Off Everyday Australians. And it is a very, very good read to help open people's eyes of what is really going on. He starts off with looking at land value capture and value uplift, which is a spatial proposition of trying to do land improvements that then will yield further taxation income for local governments to offset infrastructure costs. And if you do this on the sly, it can turn into insider trading. So this is kind of what happened in areas like Logan, Gold Coast, Ipswich, that you might have heard a couple of years ago that these investigations unfolded. Cameron Murray was one of the expert witnesses in that corruption scandal in the CCC inquiry. And this is one of the books that he's published on not just the land value issue, but the wider way that corporations engage in what we call state capture, which is where they decide. The reason why the decision makers are so weak is because the decisions have already been made by vested interests. So we got to fight back. And that's part of the research that we are doing in the community advocacy and community activism area.
And thank you to those who have joined us on Zoom this evening. And I hope you can join us again for some of the other events that we and presentations that we have at the Society here during the year.